fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Several shots were fired as President Kennedy's motorcade passed through downtown Dallas.
None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Welcome to the Hagmann Daily Show, weekdays 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And now your hosts, Joe Hagmann and Jon Robberson.
Hello and welcome to this Monday, April 9th, 2018 edition of the Hagmann Daily Show. So glad to be here today. We got a lot to get into, and we're just going to jump right in. There is a huge issue with this Syrian chemical attack, and we have seen the president's response, at least as far as Twitter is concerned, and the misreporting that has been and could lead to us to the brink of war as the war drums are beating. We're going to play a quick clip from a Paul Joseph Watson video. I have it posted at Hagmann Report. It's so important that we understand the dynamics of this situation in Syria, as we have seen what is another chemical attack, and the blame is being put on President Assad, the pro-Syrian, the Syrian military, and the pro-Syrian Russian forces. And the president's response to this is very troublesome, considering where he was with his understanding of these events and situations from 2013. And we're going to talk about, and Paul Joseph Watson lays this out beautifully. And so I think, without muddying the waters anymore with my own commentary, first we're going to play this piece from Paul Joseph Watson, and we're going to break down all the different points that he raises, and they are excellent points. As we see this continuing to unfold, this looks like they are continuing to try to get us involved more in Syria than we have been in the past. And this is not any coincidence on the heels of President Trump announcing that he was going to withdraw all the rest of the U.S. troops from Syria. And then, this is a pattern of behavior. We've seen these gas attacks before that have been launched by rebels. And in doing so, they attempt, and the media here attempts to put the blame at the feet of Assad, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And let's just do this. Let's play this 4.5-minute video of Paul Joseph Watson's expert analysis on what is happening in Syria. So let's do this. Let's just play it now, and we'll pick up on the other side.
So Trump announces he wants to pull US troops out of Syria. The Pentagon tells him it's not going to happen. And then, with the Syrian army and Russia on the verge of defeating ISIS and jihadist rebels in the town of Douma, they launch a massive chemical weapons attack that brings global condemnation, inviting massive US airstrikes across the country. And we're just supposed to swallow this entire narrative without question. No, that's insane. Now let's get this clear. No one is denying that this attack happened and that people were killed. This is horrible. But why is Trump ignoring his own warning from 2013? Again, to our very foolish leader, do not attack Syria. If you do, many very bad things will happen, and from that fight, the US gets nothing. What changed between then and now? Absolutely nothing. Apart from the fact that now ISIS was on the cusp of being eliminated, which is why it makes absolutely no sense for the Russians or the Syrian government to be behind this attack. The jihadist rebel group had agreed to leave the area within 48 hours. They'd lost the battle. 90% of eastern Ghouta was already liberated. Why on earth would the Syrian army sabotage their own victory? And why does almost every chemical weapon attack happen when the Syrian army is about to close in on a rebel stronghold? And what's the evidence here? Unverified footage from the white helmets a group with direct links to the very jihadist groups that benefit from this chemical weapons attack. Are we really going to go to war again in the Middle East on the basis of that? With no investigation whatsoever on the basis of Ivanka's tears? Up until 2016 alone, ISIS had used chemical weapons at least 52 times. A rebel-held chemical weapons factory was discovered in the same region where this happened just a few weeks ago. They found materials and plans for some of the very same chemical weapons used in this attack. Russia warned last month that militants were preparing to falsify a government chemical attack against civilians. How do we know this wasn't a false flag, given that Islamist rebels have been responsible for staging chemical weapons attacks on numerous previous occasions? It took nearly a year for Secretary of Defense James Mattis to admit there was no evidence the Syrian government was behind last year's chemical weapons attack. The attack that prompted Trump to order airstrikes against the Shayrat airbase. So why the rush to war with no real investigation of what happened? If President Obama had crossed his stated red line in the sand, the Syrian disaster would have ended long ago. Animal Assad would have been history. Yeah, and ISIS would be running the damn country. How is an attack on Syria going to resonate with Trump's base? Not very well if this poll's anything to go by. After more than 20,000 votes, 66% oppose intervention in Syria. Forget Make America Great Again. This is Make America ISIS's Air Force again. And it's completely deranged. This is the opposite of what Trump supporters voted for.
She wants to fight for rebels. There's only one problem. You don't even know who the rebels are. I don't like Assad at all, but Assad is killing ISIS. Russia is killing ISIS.
This is the same lunatic foreign policy that Hillary Clinton would have followed if she'd have won the election. The base gets that, but most Republicans don't. After last year's airstrike, which again was based on flimsy or no evidence whatsoever, 84% of Republicans approved of it, and Trump's approval ratings went higher. Is Trump deliberately embroiling the US in another war as a stunt to help the Republicans in the midterms? Just this week, a CNBC piece mentioned a conveniently timed war to do just that. Is it worth it? Is it really worth it? We can only hope that cooler heads prevail, because a full-scale attack on Syria would only embolden and empower the very jihadist rebels Trump vowed to eliminate. It would be disastrous for the Middle East and for the thousands more US troops fed into that interminable meat grinder. Mr. President.
All right, let's stop that Paul Joseph Watson video there. We have John with us. And John, I opened up with about 2 minutes of commentary laying out this Paul Joseph Watson piece. I don't know if you've had a chance to listen to it yet, but he makes some awesome points in here that really need to be looked at from what is the terrorist strongholds that had found chemical weapons facilities and plans to carry out some of the same strikes that we just saw over the last few days. And why would they jeopardize? Why would the people fighting ISIS, the Russians, the Syrian pro-Assad forces, why would they throw everything that they've been working for in defeating ISIS? Why would they throw that out the window in order to gas their own citizens? Just a couple of pieces, and then John will discuss this. President Trump issued another statement. Nothing is off the table in Syria. Trump promises decision on U.S. military action within 24 to 48 hours. And that was in the response to this alleged chemical attack in Duma. And also, Moscow has called the chemical attack fake news and warns against a Syrian intervention. Reports of the alleged gas attack in the Syrian town of Duma are fake news aimed at justifying potential strikes against Syria, Moscow said. It warned of dire consequences in the event of any military intervention. Now, while I'm not on the side of Russia, we are supposed to be, as President Trump has said, as Paul Joseph Watson said, the president ran on a non-interventionalist America First campaign. And if we want to see this America First continuing, we have to stay out of these foreign entanglements, these undeclared wars. And this is the neoconservative progressive attack. This is where they're the warmongers. They're the people who stir this conflict up, who want to be the world's policemen, and they continue to do this. And we've seen the same pattern with the Syrian chemical attacks. They've done this about 4 times now. Every time it seems like the rebels are on the verge of defeat, the ISIS is on the verge of defeat, we see these attempted false flag attacks, and whether it happened or didn't happen, that's a matter of the investigation to conclude. Many people are saying it did happen, and that's okay. But we've seen videos, tons of videos, where people have faked terror attacks, from fake car bombs and explosions to other instances, and nothing can be. We have to question everything, and it makes no sense for the Syrian pro-Assad or Assad forces to conduct this kind of attack against its citizens. There is nothing to gain and everything to lose. This is, again, part of this globalist agenda, the Obama administration and Obama era foreign policy of gutting the Middle East, gutting the leaders of the Middle East, and Assad is still that last stronghold that has not been defeated, and they're trying to force the Trump administration into finishing their agenda in the Middle East.
Absolutely. This begs a question. It's almost a follow-up question, if you will, Joe. We were all gobsmacked. We were stupefied 2.5-3 weeks ago when via Twitter, of all venues, President Trump did in fact confirm that there had been some backdoor negotiations as far as President Trump and Kim Jong-un sitting down face to face across a table from one another, and they suggested as early as May of this year. Now, we know, going all the way back to 2002 with Supreme Commander of NATO, General Wesley Clark, and that infamous, and thank God that Wesley Clark did go on record with this. As a side note, I was never a big Wesley Clark fan, but he noted the 7 countries that did not have a central banking system in place, that were not effectively, Joe, under the sort of European Union, Brussels, EU globalist finger. And Syria was one, North Korea was yet another, and the other 5, with the exception of Iran, have been dealt with. So is it possible that this maelstrom in Syria yesterday, this incident that makes, as you said, absolutely no sense strategically whatsoever, and the perplexing part is it makes no sense from the Assad regime point of view, from the Vladimir Putin Russian point of view, or, as you said, from the America First Donald Trump point of view. It makes no sense from any point of that trifecta. Is it possible that Syria had to flare back up because it looks like we may not get the war that the war hawks and the global warmongers wanted on the Korean Peninsula? Yeah, and this is it's a very ugly situation, and what can come of this is obviously where the true danger lies. Now, there have been reports of a number of reports of airstrikes, John, and you brought this to my attention too before the show, that there were reports of U.S. airstrikes in Syria, as well as there's reports of Israeli airstrikes in Syria. One report is saying that it left 14 Syrians dead from an Israeli strike, but I have not been able to verify those independently. And many people have not reported what Assad is saying, as Assad ridicules Trump with Syria chemical gas attack, as Israel anxiously awaits next move. After the long weeks of a massive assault on the East Ghouta area of suburban Damascus didn't result in the surrender of local rebels, the Syrian President Assad sought to alter the balance through aerial bombing of the town of Douma with lethal chemical weaponry. This is what's being reported. This is the narrative that they want us to not question, buy into, and respond to. As of Friday, it appeared the military efforts in the district in the town were drawing to a close against the backdrop of negotiations that Russian representatives in Syria had been conducting with the Jaish al-Islam militia, which has control of most of the district. But the negotiations broke down and fierce bombardments resumed and included the use of chemical weapons. This is what's being reported. Now they're saying that there is no doubt this is the responsibility of the Assad regime and its Russian partners. Were both well aware that the use of chemical weapons would result in backlash from across the world, but they did not care. It was a display directed at the Trump administration, this report says. I mean, this we have seen time and time again, and as this Paul Joseph Watson video points out, the last chemical attack, if you remember,
how they continued to try to blame Assad. We saw the president launch a airstrike when he was sitting down with the Chinese president at the White House. In response to that chemical attack, they launched 59 missiles towards an airbase. Well, it has since been proven that there is not one piece of evidence linking Assad or pro-Syrian forces to that attack. And we have people like Lindsey Graham, we have people like John McCain, the same old neoconservative Nazi war criminals, in my opinion, who are pushing the Trump administration to take action here. And really, if the president listens to anything we ever say, don't buy the lie. Do the research. Have everything verified before you take any other steps of action. You're going to lose your base if you lash out against Syria. It's simple.
It is that simple. And I know we're going to speak at some point here in today's broadcast about what I spent my day yesterday doing, which is writing this monster piece on what I think may be in store from the international bankers' point of view against President Trump. But you make an excellent counterpoint to the entire article that I worked on yesterday, Joe, which is there's a lot of geopolitical bear traps set for this president out there as well. And I'm going to need your help on this one because I'm not super familiar with this source. This would be agents. I guess it would be Agent French Press, but it's in French. It's I don't speak French, but it's Agent.
Okay, I have not heard of that.
It's AFP, and I got this from Josh Kaplan's Twitter feed, and just did a quick Google search. So. In fact, I'm going to send you the link right now so you can take a look at it as well.
Okay.
And bear with us, listeners, because this is obviously a developing story all the way across the board. Okay, so the headline, and this was posted April 9. The headline: Deadly missile strikes hit Syria airbase. Goes on to read: Deadly missile strikes hit a Syrian military airbase on Monday, state media said. But Washington and Paris denied carrying them out in response to an alleged poison gas attack. And again, to give credit to Josh Kaplan at the Gateway Pundit, a frequent, regular guest throughout last year on the Hagmann Report, he's been tweeting about this all morning. But this piece, Joe, goes on to say, U.S. President Donald Trump and French counterpart Emmanuel Macron had on Sunday vowed, quote, strong joint response, end quote, to the suspected chemical attack on the rebel-held town of Douma. And that's listeners, that's capital D-O-U-M-A. Joe, Douma is the exact city, and this is critical. This may be the most important thing I say in the course of our Monday broadcast today, Joe. Rick Wiles, Ed Zoll, Doc Burkhart, and the True News team reported approximately 2 weeks ago, and I would be more than happy to go to peruse through the last 6 or 8 True News broadcasts for our listeners, and for tomorrow I can isolate exactly which broadcast this was reported in, Joe. But they specifically reported, and I tweeted this out yesterday, that from a Russian source, they had information indicating that an American mercenary contingent was funding, had been channeling funds to a group caching chemical weapons in the town of Douma. That was, by the way, Joe, when we spoke offline, that was the town I could not remember the name of. D-O-U-M-A. So True News reported this 2 weeks ago. I tweeted it and tagged True News official Twitter account to the tweet, and True News did retweet my tweet this morning, serving, of course, as confirmation, albeit on Twitter, that they did report this, Joe, approximately 2 weeks ago. Now, why is this important? Because, in my opinion, this is a smoking gun. It's the first whiffs of a smoking gun. That this is a plotted, planned, construed attack, or perhaps false flag attack. And Joe, our listeners, I think at this point know, you and I are both very careful about not jumping on the false flag bandwagon every time something terrible happens in the news cycle. Both of us exercise extreme caution in not being trumpeters for the whole false flag tune. But this one stinks. This one's got trouble written all over it. I have no clue at this point what the motivation is, but what I do know, like I know my own name, is that True News reported that there was funding and chemical weapons caching happening in the town of Douma, Syria. And again, reported on TrueNews.com approximately 2 weeks ago. Go ahead, Joe.
And it's so important, John, that we do our due diligence on this story, because what we're talking about is a response that would involve a number of U.S. military personnel. It would involve the deployment and possibly, again, we're talking about a military strike on a sovereign foreign power, and that cannot be allowed to take place, especially when we see the attempted progress, or the progress that has been made under this President Trump and his administration to move the country back in what we call the right direction. But if we are to act on this false flag, if you will, whether the attack happened or not, whether it's real or not, I'm not questioning the legitimacy of whether people died or not. What I'm questioning is the who attacked who and under what stripes, and is it being reported as it really has happened? And I don't believe it is. And this is unfortunately a theme throughout history that we've seen as far as America getting involved into wars that don't make sense, are built on lies. They threw the incubators out. They threw the babies out of the incubators to the weapons of mass destructions, and on and on and on. There is a long history of wars being started through these types of false flag attacks. And John, we will get into your article, Can the Deep State JFK President Trump? Because I did read through it again, and it's a great article, and it is important.
Thank you.
And let's just move here now.
Hold on a sec. Before we move there, let's put a couple of fine points, a couple punctuation marks on your opening commentary and Paul Joseph Watson's video. I'm a little tuned up this morning. I would imagine a lot of our listeners are as well, because this is serious in capital letters. Okay. Now, Joe, I just texted to you the article from AFP, and our listeners,
I see that, yeah.
Go to AFP.com. You'll have to poke around a little bit because the URL is super, super long. But go to AFP.com, and again, the title of this article is Deadly Missile Strikes Hit Syria Airbase. Now, when you scroll down in this article, Joe, you see a map of Syria that indicates the suspected chemical attack of April 7 right outside the town of Douma in southwest Syria. Then you see this purported missile strike that, by the way, nobody's taking credit for. Immediately, President Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron both come out right away and say, it wasn't us. Well, we haven't heard anything from Vladimir Putin, and even though he could be a dark horse in this, we haven't heard anything from Xi Jinping either. But if there were missiles fired into this, what is called the T4 airbase, it looks like it's due west of Palmyra, somebody fired them. And the problem with this is we have rhetoric that's come out of the Kremlin and that's come out of the White House and that's come out of Tel Aviv, Joe, indicating that Syria is a big fat red line, and not a Barack Obama red line. This is a real red line in the sand. Your dad, Doug Hagmann, has said for about 4 years now that World War III will begin in Syria. And I know a lot of Hagmann Report listeners and regular viewers have pushed back against that notion when the Korean Peninsula has been the hot spot of the news cycle so many times during that 3 or 4 year period, Joe. But this has got the potential to pit everybody from Saudi Arabia and Israel and Iran on a regional level to the Russian Federation, the United States, and even China on the global superpower level. This could be one of the more serious issues we've reported on in the 10-plus month history of The Daily Show, Joe.
And it is. And yesterday we did the Patreon broadcast, and someone in the chat, I don't remember who it was, said, well, I don't care about Syria. What does Syria matter? And it matters a great deal when we're talking about the future of this nation, the success and progress of the Trump administration, and some of the things that wanted and should be accomplished under this administration. And one of the last things we should see is a U.S. involvement in a Syrian military conflict. Again, it's contrary to the interests of America. It's contrary to everything that the president stands for. And we can even take his own rhetoric from 2013 and past interventions in Syria to paint that picture for us. So with that, John, let's move to your piece that's up on Hagmann Report. Can the deep state JFK President Trump ask any of the secular progressive pollywogs in any of the mindless fish bowls in America what the two darkest days of their lives are, and they will echo each other? The November 8th, 2016, you say that's the election and the presidential inauguration on 20th. But John, I would say this: 9/11 is obviously what I think of as some of the darkest days in American history. And
of
again,
course, but you're not a pollywog.
right. And you go on to talk about the great divide of the American politics, body of politics, and the two different visions that this country has, and one that we decided to entrust President Trump with in carrying the mantle instead of Hillary Clinton. But I'm going to let you pick it up from here, because you have good insight into where you want to take this. But if they can't get to Trump via the economy, via some of these other ways that they're attempting to get him through the false witch hunt of the Russia investigation, what about forcing his hand into an unconstitutional war? Anything to separate the president from his base at this point, John. It seems that's where
the takeaway.
Yeah,
that's the key. That's the key right there. To now, this article is close to 4,000 words, so for expediency's sake, I won't obviously try to summarize the entire piece. But what I would call this article, if I had to qualify it in a category, Joe, I would say it's me sitting down on a Sunday morning and afternoon wargaming what I see the next 12 months of President Trump's administration possibly unfolding to look like. And the basic thesis of the article is simply this, and I'm very curious to get your take on this. I know we've kind of discussed it offline a little bit, but we can definitely extrapolate it today for our listeners. My thesis was, we have witnessed, Joe, from Don Lemon to Robert Mueller and my personal favorite, Brian Stelter, and Rachel Maddow and all of the leftist media ilk, we have witnessed a systematic, relentless attack on this president. And I quipped in the article, sort of humorously, they've tried everything from Diet Coke to special counsels.
And I got an example of this when you're done. We're going to play a quick clip
of
Joy Reid. What if Trump refuses to be arrested by federal marshals? This is them talking about, the federal marshals need to come in and detain President Trump for up to 18 months or until he, will allow himself to be questioned by the special counsel. But they're actually talking about arresting the president of the United States without evidence, without crime, without charges, just so he can be questioned by Robert Mueller, and they think this is okay. But go ahead, John.
Well, that's an excellent example of the premise that this article starts from, which is the mainstream media has had just over 15 months to systematically attack President Trump. And one of two things is happening here, again, in my opinion. Either the mainstream media is failing in their systematic, relentless, perpetual attacks on this president, or they're setting up a slow kill shot that they believe will actually begin to hemorrhage, that will bleed this president out on November 6th of 2018 when the midterms come. Now, we've got to examine this idea of the blue wave. If the blue wave crashes over Capitol Hill and the Democrats they don't even have to take both the House and Senate. They've only got to take the House to invoke articles of impeachment. Now, just like what we witnessed happening with Bill Clinton in the late 90s, that would most likely result in articles of impeachment moving through the House of Representatives and then being stymied and stopped in the Senate. Again, that's what happened with Clinton. But if they took both houses, then as I mentioned a week ago, listeners and viewers of the Hagmann Daily Show, the Doug Hagmann Radio Show, and the Hagmann Report can sit back and enjoy all through 2019 the team at Hagmann Report attempt to parse through every nuance of something that will make the Mueller special counsel look legit in its veracity. So here's my point. The blue wave is the next big question mark. And I believe personally that and it's so funny that the Syria thing would blow up as big as it has, pardon the pun, today, because my hypothesis was, until November, I don't see the globalists making a huge move against this president like they did against JFK. because they've got the November 6th option. That's clearly on the table. If they can take one of the houses on Capitol Hill, again, particularly the House of Representatives, they can invoke articles of impeachment. And that's a move that would not necessarily put the 60-plus million voters who voted Trump, Joe, in 2016 up in arms. You're not going to see the secession of South Carolina or Texas. You're not going to see roadblocks go up and citizens going to the guns, so to speak, if impeachment proceedings occur, because the average American is more or less going to go along with the narrative. If they were to do something horrific like they did to JFK to President Trump, then it's game on. It's game on. There would be violence all over this country. It would be time to get very small in your given location. But here's the trick. And I'll shut up after this, Joe, because I want to get some feedback from you. Imagine November 7th of this year. The blue wave is in fact a red tsunami. We have both houses held by the Republicans. Is it not possible that the European Union banksters, the foreign internationalists, the globalists, from the Rothschild family, the Rockefellers, Queen Beatrix, etc., would they not perhaps mandate that the mainstream media's intent, their attacks have failed? Now we need to use the economy. We need to weaponize global banking. We need to use things like the fact that American, and this is important, listeners, please hear me on this because this is for your own benefit. You are an unsecured credit liability with your bank. You are no longer a depositor. That law changed January 1st, 2013 in the post-Greek Cypriot bail-in era. What that means in English is you don't own the money on your bank statement you think you own. I put links in the article. Go ahead and do your own research. Number two, the money that you pay your mortgage to each month, that mortgage is not held, that title is not held by the banking institution that you pay your money to. Joe, we've had guests on the Hagmann Report that have gone into exhaustive detail about the mortgage-backed security scandal. And number three, the bail-in model has been specifically set up and designed for the American bank customer to pay for the irresponsible fractional reserve lending practices from their given bank. I don't care if you bank at Wells Fargo or Bank of America or Chase or wherever. All of these financial weapons of mass destruction, Joe, have been put in place going back as many as 5-6 years, far before candidate Trump became President Trump. So my hypothesis in this entire article, to sum it up, is simply this. If the blue wave does not happen this November, Joe, do you think the international bankers will take the front seat and they will use the economy to take out the chief executive upon whose watch the American people see their wallets robbed?
Well, it's a very real possibility, and we know that with the way that they move their agenda forward, it seems as though issues that are on the front and center are those that make the politics divisive. Yet when we see things that aren't talked about, like the economy and different things, that's when they seem to move on those. It seems like when the issues are not front and center, when they're not a topic of debate and contention, that's when they get the most push, or when they do something to make the outrage, like the Syria example, when they do something to create public outrage or the public that demands action or a change. That's another way that they are able to push their agenda through faster than normal. So yeah, I mean, we could see a economic event where it ruins what was built so far in the economy and makes Trump's base move away from their support for him. Anything to move to, as we said earlier, that can move the people's support away from the president, they are willing to try, on top of all the other antics and games that they play. But John, I want to go back to this piece that we mentioned. MSNBC Joy Reid. What if Trump refuses to be arrested by federal marshals? Sunday on her weekend morning program, MSNBC's Joy Reid seriously discussed a situation where President Trump refused a subpoena and would have to be arrested and put in jail until he testified before a grand jury. Reid envisioned a scenario of White House besieged by federal marshals who would wait for Trump to give the Secret Service stand-down order so he could be taken into custody. And I'm not going to play this clip. It's obviously, but this is the mindset of the media. It's not Hillary Clinton that needs to go to jail. No. She needs to be president.
Well, but Nick, that brings me.
President Trump who is the criminal and needs to be locked up. But this is the insanity of the media, and this is the direction that they want to go, and this is what they want. This is what they really believe. These extreme leftists really believe that the president should be in jail.
Yes, it is.
But it is not something that's going to happen. But, John, I want to switch gears here because this is something I know we wanted to talk about on the show. London Mayor Sadiq Khan enacts knife control policies to crack down on the stabbing epidemic. What is going on in London? The London mayor is taking action by implementing knife control. In response to the spike in crime, Khan deployed over 300 additional London police officers into the city's most crime-ridden neighborhoods to stop and search anyone they suspected of carrying a knife. In the U.S., such policies are very controversial and possibly violate the Fourth Amendment, but in England, police are able to stop and search anyone they suspect is carrying a knife. The tough and immediate measures also ban home deliveries of knives and acid, two of the most common weapons in London today.
I've got a joke.
Where does this end? Where does it end?
You and I both know, as former ruffians and rapscallions, that acid and knife play do not go together. But I think I'm referring to a different kind of acid. Obviously, Sadiq Khan means acid that they throw in women's faces. Joe, I tweeted yesterday, quote, "We were joking on the Hagmann Daily Show when we suggested this mayor enforce knife control, but he's actually doing it." And then I made an entreaty to our British friends. British friends, move over here. Let's put 1776 behind us. Your situation looks pretty hopeless. We'll go shooting. That was my tweet picking up on the dailywire.com article that you just mentioned. Joe, did you see the picture of the London officials all standing around that table with literally wringing their hands and looking like they've got their heads bowed in some form of quasi
I did not see
as
that.
they stare at everything from like a paring knife to a serrated fixed blade hunting knife. They are actually, what's next? Will they ban staple guns or pipe wrenches? I mean, this is out of control. I also tweeted yesterday, let me think. When was the last time I saw a knife leap from its sheath and plunge into someone? Oh yeah, never. And that's how ridiculous this has devolved. But Joe, you always make this point, and frankly, it kind of irritates me sometimes when you do. Not because I disagree with you, but because I agree with you. This harkens back to the Paul Joseph Watson piece 3 weeks ago on Sweden. And what was the first thing you said in the studio that day? You looked at me and said, "This is coming here," and that makes me irritable because I like to think that America has got enough men left in it that we wouldn't let this happen here. And yet, if you look at it politically and from a broad ideological point of view, you're exactly right. It is happening here. We are not blaming knives, an inanimate object, designed to, butcher meat or carve a piece of wood, but we're doing the exact same thing to an inanimate object in the form of an AR-15 that, if it's left alone, will lie on a table collecting dust.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, and that's what the mayor is not blaming the criminal immigrants that they have brought into the country. He's not blaming the criminal element either, who has already been part of the country. What they're doing is trying to blame these inanimate objects. And John, on Saturday morning, we saw reports out of Munster, Germany, that a terrorist attack took place as a car or van drove into a crowd of people. And at what point do you have to stop and say, "Oh, we're going to ban the cars, we're going to ban the knives, we're going to ban the guns"? We have said this a million times, and we'll say it 1,000,001. The murder has been around since the beginning of human history, and for whatever reason,
since Cain and Abel.
Yeah, it's the spiritual attack, or the spiritual battle that has ramped up the violence that we see in our society. But they never talk about that on the news. They're only going to try to blame the things. So it's an end around to get what they want. And they want, in America, the police state where there is no First Amendment, there is no Second Amendment, there is no Fourth Amendment. And they have that in Europe. And look what they've done in Europe. Now they continue. Now they want to, they've criminalized speech. Now they're trying to ban guns. And This article from The Blaze says the irony of the matter. During his mayoral campaign in 2015, Khan said he would do everything in my power to cut, stop, and search policies, claiming it undermines public confidence in local government and policy systems. And now he is calling this same technique, the stop and search, or cut, stop, and search, as a vital tool to combat crime in London. So you see, these people are, they have no principles, they have no standards, they go where the wind blows, and even to the point of turning themselves into hypocrites and implementing policies that they even ran against. You're never going to be able to ban weapons to a point where people don't kill each other. There is no utopias dream that's going to come to fruition if you can just make everything perfect. That's not the nature of human beings, and you can't make it the nature of human beings. You can't legislate morality, and that's the true problem here, John. We have a moral and spiritual problem, and they're trying to put the blame on inanimate objects instead of identifying what the true problem is and seeking to solve it from there.
Well, that segues perfectly. I just want to share quickly, Joe, a couple of lines out of this article that I pinned yesterday, and a special thanks to Steve Quayle at stevequayle.com, who just reposted the piece, because this ties in perfectly and it sort of summarizes what you were just saying, and I think it'll propel our conversation. I wrote, as we explore this analysis of the political possibilities that face 45th President of the United States, President Donald J. Trump, consider the baseline of ignorance that more often than not precedes the violence instigated by the left. Their shrill rhetoric, stupid signs, and street thug behavior are clearly demonstrable of Mussolini's black shirts and Hitler's brown shirts prior to and throughout World War II. Fascism, to be precise, is the marriage of corporate and state interests presided over by the 1%, funded by the taxpayers' dollars, and paid for by our soldiers in blood. Examine Soviet-era communism, Hitlerian National Socialism, and throw in Venezuela. Here's the key. Throw in Venezuela's democide by starvation, lorded over by a former bus driver, and one thing becomes apparent very quickly. This is it right here. This is what we have to guard against. It's what we're seeing happen in London, and we're seeing it happen in Sweden and Venezuela, and we cannot let it happen here, Joe. One thing becomes apparent very quickly. A parasitic populace of elite cronies gorge themselves on the wealth of the state while the population withers into emaciated ghosts of their former selves. And the top-tier criminal class has the arrogance and audacity to proclaim their benevolence for the people every time a camera or a mic is thrust in front of their bloated, mustachioed faces. And I go on to compare the Obama, Clinton, and Lyndon Baines Johnson policies to, if you take their policies and you extrapolate them out to the extreme, which unfortunately is not even appearing too extreme any longer, Joe, you begin to see that they are not dissimilar. In fact, they're just different points on the same linear projection of political ideology. And that ideology has been proven time and time again to be a complete failure. Now, last week, I said that over 100 million people died in the 20th century at the hand of their government. Interestingly, your dad, Doug Hagmann, that very evening on the Hagmann Report, indicated that the number is closer to 200 million in the 20th century, according to his research. And I tend to think he may be right, because I know Mao killed over 50 million by himself.
Oh, yeah.
So we have a situation here where the desire to be politically correct, you could almost take political correctness and think of it like this. For non-believers, for people who have chosen to eschew or avoid or deny the Christian faith, they have no basis from which to work. They don't use the Ten Commandments. They really don't want to use the Constitution. They're certainly not going to use the Bible. So they have to sort of develop their moral platform as they go along. And what they do is lick their finger and stick it in the wind, and whatever the majority seems to be going with, they go with it too. That's a sort of bonehead definition of political correctness. The problem is it's working. It's working all over the world. It's working as per Paul Joseph Watson's videos. It's working in Sweden and in London and in all of the major metropolitan regions of this country. And the last point I'd like to make, the reason that I chose to use in this title, Joe, Can the Deep State JFK President Trump? Consider who John Kennedy was. I think he was the first mega presidential candidate. He was just like President Trump in a lot of ways. He came from East Coast establishment money. He knew privilege and prestige most of his life. And something happened to John Kennedy that made him want to be a president for the people. And yet he was haunted through his just short of 1,000 days of being president by the same traps that seem to be hounding President Trump. And what I mean by that is, I've been concerned from day one about President Trump's foreign policy, about the strange things that he tweets out about, my button's bigger than yours and mine works. I mean, that's kind of like a quote unquote urinating contest to clean it up for the Daily Show. These things concern me, and I think that there's a lot of interesting similarities between Kennedy and Trump. And if our listeners are interested in this, by all means, go read the article. But here's the key difference between President Kennedy and President Trump. President Kennedy, he made two major threats in 1962. The first was to tear up the CIA and scatter it to the winds. And the second was through Executive Order 11110 to, some believe, move us back toward sound, real money. And we saw just less than 10 years later, President Richard Nixon, actually 15 years later, Richard Nixon in 1971 removed us permanently from sound money. This is all in the article. They killed President Kennedy. But Joe, back then, I think most Americans still believed in their government. I think most Americans believed that the government were the good guys. It was right after World War II, and I think we thought, oh, the government would never do something like that. I'll bet you in 1964, if you walked into the average beer hall in America and said that the CIA killed Kennedy, some hard hat, blue collar type would probably punch you in the nose. Yeah. But that's not the world we live in today. If the deep state tried to 86 President Trump, there's an enormous contingent of Americans that would be literally up in arms. So I don't think that will happen. But the two areas, and I wish I'd touched on this in the article, I just didn't know the Syria thing was coming. If geopolitically and from the international money scam, from the whole Federal Reserve central banking scam, and all of this, listeners, ties back into that 2002 remark made by General Wesley Clark. He publicly went on record and said there are 7 countries that the globalists do not control. Somalia, Iraq, Iran, Libya, North Korea, and Syria. And we've now, quote unquote, dealt with 4 of the 7, and the 3 that remain, Syria, Iran, and North Korea, are the most difficult ones to deal with. Korea, because they're nuclear armed, Iran, for the same reason, and Syria, because Putin has made it very clear, if you attack Syria, Russia will attack you. So as we move forward, we've got to realize, and this is my exhortation for our listeners today, please don't sit back on your butts and smugly soak in the amazing fact that President Trump got elected over Hillary Clinton. That's last year's. In fact, that's 2016's news. This
John,
president
that was
is in trouble.
That is just the very beginning point of this fight. That is, and what is so unfortunate is so many people think that is the end, or they should take a break or don't have to be so concerned. But that was only the very needle point of the beginning. There's such a long way to go.
You said it, and I've been on a long rant, so I want to give it back to you, Joe. But at the end of the day, I normally, this is not self-promotion, so please don't misunderstand it that way, listeners. But I spent a long time on this piece, and it's not the gospel truth or the gospel according to me. It's just a war game speculative piece asking all of you, the listeners, the readers, and the viewers who are kind enough to give us your time every day, what do you think of this? And as soon as we wrap the show, Joe, I will open the comments on the piece. And also, of course, you can reach out to us, studio at hagmanandhagmann.com. Tell us what parts you agree with. Tell us what parts you disagree with. Let's get a discourse going here, because just like you said, Joe, the election of President Trump was not the end of the fight. It was the beginning of the fight. And we must protect this president in the midterms, even if you've got to truck on down to your local voting place, plug your nose, and vote for somebody like Lindsey Graham. I hate to say it. I just cringe to say it. We've got to keep the House and the Senate. That's number one. And number two, we've got to hold this president accountable without abandoning him. And that's key, Joe. I'll make that my final comment, hand it back to you. We must keep President Trump accountable without abandoning him.
Yeah, absolutely we do. And accountability is a huge thing. And I think he understands that responsibility to his base, although he does treat it more cavalierly than one would think, especially saying things like, well, I'll take the heat for this over the immigration, or, I'll sign this bill this time with the spending bill. But I think he does understand that he has just a certain amount of leeway before he is, going to be really curtailed by his base. But in the last few minutes, John, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to switch gears to something I published on Hagmann Report that I think is very insightful. Is progressivism satanic? This is a piece from TrevorLoudon.com, and it goes on to say the following. Yes, at first glance, the title of this piece appears to be provocative. Indeed, some will refuse to continue reading. However, it is provocative only under two conditions. First, when viewed within the frame of reference to which we've become conditioned, that is, progressivism and religion, are examined as totally separate and distinct topics, a conceptual version of so-called separation of church and state, if you will. Second, it's provocative if this writer had deliberately crafted it just to get a reaction. Neither condition applies. The title's question is a serious one, and this place makes a case for concluding that yes, progressivism is satanic. Regarding that conclusion, a reader's skepticism at this stage is expected. We've become conditioned to regard liberalism or progressivism as one of two major political leanings and something akin to the other team in a sports league. And we have to look at what they say. Progressivism is not just a political preference, but instead originates from a more powerful and sinister source and carries with it the existential danger that origin implies. After all, if Satan is the great deceiver, would not a political and cultural movement that appears to be secular in origin, actions and goals serve his purpose? Would not a secular, political, and cultural be natural avenues for advancing his aims? Indeed, since the followers are by definition unbelievers, then it is not some sort of secular faith in church. It is to advance his evil aims. And it goes on to talk about, are we dealing with a good versus evil fight? And I'll just say this as a side note. While we call progressivism evil or satanic, that does not mean conservatism is the opposite of that. But it goes on from there, and it's a great article. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but from what they stand for, and we'll just throw one example out there: abortion. These people are abortionists to a religious belief. And we see that to where
almost like a sacrificial sacrament type thing.
Oh yeah, yeah, and also the perversion, the pushing of perversion, and that can encompass anything from transgenderism to homosexuality to pedophilia. And we see it with the economy, with their socialist and their Marxist push with the borders, to break the laws and destroy a society through multiculturalism, and on and on. This article really goes out to lay out a number of premises. Here's one. Satan, the great deceiver, has enlisted a cadre of what we will refer to as hell's useful idiots, people who have good intentions and believing they are advancing good, but are actually serving Satan and his ends. It is said that Lenin coined the phrase useful idiots to describe naive dupes who advance the communist cause, yet knew not what they do. As we'll soon see, we could fairly classify Lenin as one of Satan's understudies, and that the actual origin of the phrase useful idiots, the root cause for the phenomenon, precedes Lenin. Then it goes on to talk about this. In turn, deploying hell's useful idiots to advocate seemingly secular aims, which result in what appear to be secular manifestations, but which beneath the surface advance a root cause, advancements of Satan's evil ends, would be within his bag of tricks. Even we humans, we mere mortals, can comprehend that. And from that book I read last week, Past, Present, and Future, the author made a great point. If Satan is able to deceive angels in heaven who are in God's presence constantly, what chance does man have, especially a man who has not belief in Jesus? And we can follow those thoughts through their natural conclusions and see where it makes a lot more sense, the society we live in today, looking at it and seeing what is promoted, what is looked upon as good. And it's the opposite of what Scripture tells us is good. It is the complete opposite. And it's unfortunate, but this is the road that we are on.
Well, Joe, we're gonna what we can do, what we can promise to our listeners and viewers is that we're going to remain level-headed. Number one, we're going to remain tempered in our analysis of the news to the best of our capabilities. We're humans too, and it's easy to get tuned up, especially with issues like today in Syria. We're going to write and read and research and broadcast, and that's what we're going to do to give listeners and viewers as many tools as the Lord will bless us with, Joe, to put in their toolboxes to use as we see the breakdown of this presidency and this country at the hands of these secular progressives, the reprobates, the relativists, who may not, as you said, they're through their naivete, they're satanic dupes. Much like a big actor in Hollywood can be absolutely working for the devil in everything they do. They're a very potent weapon, and they don't even know it. And those are some of Satan's most formidable soldiers. So this is a spiritual battle, and on the Hagmann Daily Show, we're just going to do our level best to take it one breath and one step at a time. And we will share it with you folks to the best of our ability.
There's a piece from WorldNet Daily, Jews murdered for being Jews in France, where hate crime laws protect those inciting hatred, not victims. And this article goes on to say, as a child, Marine Knoll barely escaped the sweeping 1942 Nazi-inspired wartime roundup of 13,000 Jews in Paris, most of whom were sent to the notorious Auschwitz death camps. But just over 2 weeks ago, on Friday, March 23rd, a week before Passover, at the age of 85, Mrs. Knoll was raped, tortured, and murdered in her apartment in Trebes, a small town in southwestern France, by a young Muslim man she had known since he was 7 years old, who shouted Allah Akbar during his anti-Jewish bloodlust rampage. The disabled grandmother was stabbed 11 times and her body burned, according to law enforcement, by two men, one of whom, Jens Milub, the primary suspect, was previously jailed for 6 months for sexually assaulting the daughter of a woman who helped look after Mrs. Knoll. The heinous anti-Semitic crime has blown the lid off what has become a pattern of such attacks in France in the last 5 years, in which some 250 murders have been committed by Muslims, according to a professor at the University of Paris who's authored 27 books on France and Europe. Today, France is the only country in the Western world where Jews are murdered simply for being Jews. French Jews live in constant insecurity. The men who murder them evidently do not hesitate to break into homes and attack elderly women. They seem to know they can threaten their future victims without fear of arrest. Most often than not, the police do not even record the complaints of Jews who go to the police station, but simply note in the daybook that a Jew is claiming threats came and went. I'll post that up on Hagmann Report because we only have about a minute left. But this is a huge, very disturbing trend that we are seeing, the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, as well as these hate crime laws, which are there and are apparently designed to, I guess, go after people who commit verbal hate crimes. But what happens when the laws are selectively enforced, as we see, John? And this is a big problem with these hate speech laws. They only go after those who they deem are in political opposition to them. Therefore, they can silence them, and they won't go after those that they don't care about, like Muslims making hate slurs against Jewish people, and then even following up on their verbal attacks with real ones. So it's a pretty crazy situation in
But it's so much bigger because the Muslim faith, the whole thing comes from the biblical Ishmael. And is it a coincidence, Joe, that the number one rapists and murderers and persecutors of God's chosen people, the Jews, are the global Islam? The global Islam are the number one people who try to kill, maim, rape, torture, and otherwise commit these hate crimes against the Jews. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the Old Testament. This is a massive spiritual battle that plays out every day in the news through politics and street brawls and Antifa and the European Union and all of these things. But Joe, at the end of the day, what we're seeing are examples every day of a massive spiritual battle. And we as Christians and as red-pilled Christians have a massive job ahead of us, which is to move through this, analyze it, share the information with others, and not take this lying down, not for one single day.
John, we are out of time. I want to thank you for a great show, joining us over in the other side of the country. And I know it's 3 hours behind, but we will be here all week. John will be with us all week. And we will see you tonight at Hagmann Report at 7. Until then, have a great day.
The Hagmann Daily Show is brought to you by the Hagmann Report. Tune in to the Hagmann Report weekdays, 7 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. For more information, go to HagmannReport.com. That's HagmannReport.com.